Happy Tuesday and welcome to day 3 of Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color, an open training series. Today we're going to dive into how to cultivate and grow fundraising strategies. So we're going to give people about 1 more minute to continue to join the webinar, and then we'll kick things off. Hello and welcome. Thank you again for joining Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color, an open training series. Today we'll be covering how to cultivate and grow fundraising strategies. My name is Olivia Harp. I am the program manager for network building here at Prosperity Now, and I'm just here to get you situated on the platform as we dive into today's wonderful webinar. So just a few housekeeping tips. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and mailed out to registrants within a week. All of you are muted to ensure sound quality, but please don't don't make that keep you from engaging us. Ask questions, share your thoughts, comments, anything that comes to mind using the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you experience any technical issues, please email us personally at gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. Sorry. Just to get the most out of today's call, I know it's a dreary Tuesday morning here in the Washington, D.C. area. So we want you to join from a quiet place and get super cozy. Grab a coffee, a snack, even breakfast. And again, engage us in the questions and comments box as you listen. We want to hear everything that you have to say and reflect on ways to apply what you learned today to your work. Everything we do at Prosperity Now, we want to ensure that it's applicable for you all. So please think of ways that you can use today's content in your everyday work. As many of you know, Prosperity Now's mission is to ensure everyone in our country has a clear path to financial stability and wealth and prosperity. Before we hop into today's agenda, I do want you all to answer a quick poll. We just want to get a feel of who is in the room. So the question that we're asking you all today is, which category best describes your organization's role? So are you into funding, policy and advocacy, research and development, community engagement or direct services, or media and communications? Which of these best describe your organization's role? Okay, so the results are in. Kind of what I expected. A lot of you are in direct services or community engagement. So you have your boots on the ground out there in the community making an impact. Next up, we have people from policy and advocacy, and people from research and development and media and communications are tied. So for today's agenda, we're wrapping up the housekeeping and welcome. Joelle will come in and give you a little bit of background around the history of building high impact nonprofits of color. I'm sorry, everyone. Then Rachel will come in and she'll talk about fundraising, diversifications, and all that great stuff. And then we'll go into a group discussion and Q&A before closing the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Joelle Hughley. She is the Senior Program Manager for Racial Economic Justice.
Hello, good morning to everybody, and happy to have you all here. I'm always glad to to welcome folks on to participate in today's training. So, like mentioned, my name is Joelle Hughley. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the Racial Economic Justice Department, or the programs team. And I'll talk a little bit more about what Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color is, why we're creating this training for the first place, and how this relates to Prosperity Now. Next slide. So Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color has been a program we've done for the past, let's say, 6 or 7 years. And it's been an opportunity to really center nonprofits that are led by and serving communities of color, and looking for opportunities to lift up these high impact and asset building organizations to really address the racial wealth divide and national challenges through economic development and through addressing a deep economic divide. And this program really looks at centering the operational needs and capacity building needs of these nonprofits that are typically underfunded, overworked, and kind of overstretched. So always wearing multiple hats and trying to do everything at the same time, but while still doing really, really great and valuable work for the community. So this program has been a cohort model that we base off of building up capacity building and operational needs. So through fundraising, our last program, or our last training was around board development, and the one before that was communications. So really these core departments in an organization, excuse me, that helps to develop and expand the work that is being done and exposing the great value that you add to the community. So this program is just a start to center the equity and center nonprofits that are led by and serving communities of color. Next slide. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you our trainer for today. We have Rachel Spiegner, who is a wonderful consultant and has a wealth of information to share. So with that, I will go ahead and let you take the lead. Oh, Rachel, you're still on mute.
Yep, of course. Well, thank you all again so much for joining the session. And Joelle, thank you for the introduction, and Prosperity Now for the opportunity to present to you all today. And so during this session, I want to make sure we cover a few different areas that can help your organization with its fundraising efforts throughout the year. So today we'll cover types of funding, diversifying funding streams, developing a funding strategy, the cycle of philanthropy, and organizational readiness and fundraising tools. And as Joelle mentioned, I am a philanthropic partnerships director for a national nonprofit, and I'm also a fundraising consultant. I have been in the nonprofit sector for 11 years, specifically focused on fundraising. Most of my experience has been working directly with foundations and gaining grant support from foundations and corporations, which builds into my 15-year experience working in philanthropy across multiple sectors. So in addition to the nonprofit sector, I have also worked in higher education around grants and contracts, and I've also done some work in athletic development and higher education for a major university, as well as working across some sports organizations on their philanthropic community relations side. So again, I'm excited to be here with you all today and just share my knowledge with you around cultivating and growing fundraising strategies. Next slide, please. So before we jump into diversifying funding streams and developing a fundraising strategy, it's important to make sure everyone has general definitions of the terms we're going to cover in the presentation. And since I don't know everyone's experience level with fundraising, I want to make sure we cover a few definitions first. So what is fundraising? Fundraising is the seeking of financial support for a charity cause or another enterprise, and fundraising is important because it furthers your organization's mission, it supports programs, builds relationships, and sustains the organization. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we are covering some funding streams that we will cover later in the presentation. And this is not an exhaustive list of all the funding streams that your organization could potentially pursue. However, these are a few, again, that we'll cover today. So we'll talk about individual donors, grants, sponsorships, and events mostly. Some other funding streams your organization could pursue include fees for goods and services, membership dues and fees, and then not shown here on this slide are merchandise that your organization could sell, peer-to-peer fundraising, and cause marketing. Next slide, please. And if you see me looking down, I'm making sure I'm not missing any critical points for any of the slides. So again, I want to make sure we're all starting with a general definition of what these funding streams are, so that will be helpful as we go through the rest of the presentation. So an individual donor is actually the most common nonprofit donor category. And an individual donor is a person who donates money to a charity or nonprofit organization. This type of donor, depending on your organization, can be broken down into prospects, new donors, longtime donors, also major donors, grassroots donors. The number and the types of donor, the ways in which you break down your donors ultimately depends on your organization. This is the most common nonprofit donor category. Next slide. Then we have grants. So a grant is a financial donation given to an organization. Grants are typically given by a foundation, corporation, or government agency, and many nonprofits can be partially or even entirely funded by the grants they receive throughout the year. And so some examples of grants, the first two, I'm sure we're probably all familiar with: general operating support and program support. But there are some other grants that you can apply for, which include capacity building grants, organizational grants. If your organization is new, you could potentially apply for startup grants. And then there are some around technology. Next slide, please. And then we'll touch on sponsorships. So a corporate sponsorship is a payment by a business to a nonprofit to further the nonprofit's mission. They are generally recognized by the nonprofit with an acknowledgement that the business has supported the nonprofit's activities, programs, or special events. Next slide, please. And then the last definition that we'll cover, well, we have one more slide of definitions, but the last funding stream definition that we'll cover it's fundraising events. So a fundraising event is designed to raise awareness and donations for an organization's mission. A fundraising event can be a concert, silent auction, half marathon, neighborhood cookout, a bake sale, a gala, etc. So those are some examples of fundraising events. Next slide, please. Now, in the last few slides, I talked about the different types of funding that your organization could potentially pursue. Now, it is important to consider the use of the funding as we talk about funding streams and how they might apply to your organization. So two things I want to introduce to you if you are new to it. If you have been in fundraising for a while, you understand the use of restricted funds versus unrestricted funds. So with restricted dollars, this is money that is given to your organization for a specific purpose, and those dollars are restricted to that purpose and cannot be used for any other expense within your nonprofit. And then we have unrestricted funds, and that is money that can be used for any legal purpose appropriate to your organization. So an example of restricted funds could be if your organization is operating a building campaign, for example, to build a new building for your organization, and you receive money from individual donors, foundations, corporations, etc., you can only use those dollars for that building fund. You cannot take those funds to apply them to other purposes within the organization because those donors gave you those dollars specifically for that building fund. Now, when it comes to unrestricted funds, that's typically the general operating support dollars, or if an individual donor just writes a check for your organization and they don't apply it or they don't restrict it to a certain program or a certain initiative that your organization is currently operating, those generally fall under unrestricted dollars and again can be used for any legal purpose to the organization. Next slide, please. So I always like to include this slide just to give individuals a sense of how much money is being donated to charity in the United States. And I always go to Giving USA. They have an annual report on philanthropy that comes out every year, and you can get a sense of where the dollars are going within the United States. So in 2022, Americans gave $499 billion to charity. And on the left-hand side under source, I've broken down where the majority of those dollars were given from, were given by, and then on the right-hand side, the top 3 recipients. So as you can see here, 64% of the $499 billion that were given to charity was given by individual donors, which aligns with the definition that we went over, that individual donors are the most common funding stream for organizations. And then 21% was given by foundations, 9% was given by bequests, and 6% was given by corporations. On the right side, showing the top 3 recipients, there's a full list if you access their infographic and report on givingusa.org. However, the 27% of the $499 billion was given to religion, 14% was given to human services, and 13% was given to education. So if you want to read more about just general fundraising data across the United States, where the dollars are going, I highly recommend visiting Giving USA's annual report an infographic that you can download, and it can be useful to the work that your organization is doing. And I also want to note that $499 billion, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's Giving USA said that was actually a decrease from the previous year. I believe the number was around 10%. So I, again, recommend checking out that infographic. Next slide, please. And then I want to get into some current fundraising trends that might be helpful to your organization as we get into the next section around diversifying our revenue streams. So I pulled a couple of these from a LinkedIn article on what new fundraising trends you need to know related to the nonprofit fundraising industry. And then the first one is something that I have really been interested in lately, and that's artificial intelligence and fundraising. So as you've probably seen all over like social media and just other parts of the internet, artificial intelligence has really been booming this year, especially with platforms like ChatGPT and Bard and things like that. And so I actually recently attended a session that talked about how fundraisers are using artificial intelligence in their fundraising efforts. And someone said they use it for helping to develop their individual donor letters, or someone else used it to help them develop an email to cultivate a donor. So if you haven't looked into artificial intelligence, I highly recommend attending a training or a webinar session on how artificial intelligence is impacting fundraising. I will say one of the cons that I took away from the session that I attended was that artificial intelligence, when it comes to gathering data points, as many of you know, if you write grants, you need to provide data for why your work is necessary. And so when you're asking the artificial intelligence for data points, making sure you double check those sources to make sure they're accurate and the points that they're providing are correct. So the second is online giving and mobile giving. So we're all on our phones all day, every day. And so over the last few years, online giving and mobile giving has dramatically increased compared to in the past, where an individual donor may sit down and write a check, or sit at a laptop and make a donation. So when it comes to online and mobile giving, there are platforms like Facebook and Instagram that allow you to create donate pages for your organization, or you can create a cause for your birthday and your friends can give towards that cause. So online and mobile giving is definitely huge and will continue to grow as we all become even more attached to our phones and tablets over the next few years. And then the last fundraising trend that stood out to me was the continuation of virtual and hybrid events. So during the height of the pandemic, for organizations that held events, we switched to the virtual model, or we just didn't have the event at all. But from the LinkedIn article, what they are saying is that organizations are continuing to offer the virtual and hybrid model of events because the virtual option allows you to expand your network of individuals who can give to your organization, compared to those who can only attend in person. So offering that virtual and hybrid model has been a great value add to organizations and increasing their donations and, again, their network to get money in the door. Next slide, please. excuse the placement of the poll question, but so in this section, we're going to talk about diversifying funding streams. So we have a poll question for everyone to take. And that question is, how many funding streams does your organization currently have? Okay, so it looks like most of the people have 3 or more funding streams. A good amount have 2 to 3, and a small percentage have 1. Okay, great. So the majority of you all understand the importance of having funding streams and why you should diversify the income that's coming to your organization. Next slide. So diversifying the revenue to your organization is important because it supports the sustainability of your organization, and you don't have to rely just on one funding stream, right? So for example, if your organization is only, if your largest fundraising, if your largest revenue generation is through an event, and you think about the pandemic and we were unable to meet in person, that is one revenue stream that you cannot meet for the year, and then that could have greatly impacted your organization. So when you talk about diversifying your revenue streams, you want to make sure that you do it so that you're thinking about the long-term sustainability of your organization, and you don't have to rely just on one stream to keep your organization afloat. So when diversifying your revenue streams, it helps to reduce dependence on one funding stream. It helps improve your financial stability. It helps you to pursue new opportunities. It helps to increase your impact on the community and increase your growth potential. Next slide, please. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk through how to diversify your funding streams and what steps you should take. And then I will also include some examples. Some of them may work for your organization. You may already be doing some of them, some may not. And it's important to keep in mind that not every idea will work for your organization. So I will talk about measuring your progress later on in the presentation. So before diversifying your funding streams, you want to make sure you assess your current funding. So when you're assessing your current funding, you want to understand what is and is not working by analyzing your current fundraising methods. You want to determine which sources are stable and which might be inconsistent. You want to identify new sources of funding and make informed decisions about which strategy to pursue. And you want to consider your current capacity to take on a new funding stream. So for the bullet to identify new sources of funding and make informed decisions about which strategies to pursue, you definitely want to make sure you are researching which funding streams will work best for your organization. You don't just want to say, oh, we have individual donors, let's go ahead and add grants. You want to make sure that that is the right decision for your organization, as well as, you want to make sure it's the right decision for your organization. And you want to assess your team's capacity. Maybe you don't have someone on your team who has the capacity to write grants every day. Maybe your organization doesn't have the infrastructure to handle grants, or like, can your program team handle an influx of grants, which might lead to new initiatives, things like that. So that's what I mean when I say consider current capacity to take on a new funding stream. Funding streams not only impact the fundraising team, but they also impact other teams across your organization. So as you are assessing what is working, what is not working for your organization, and considering taking on a funding stream, making sure you talk to, I would say, the directors or the chiefs of the appropriate teams to make sure that by taking on this new funding stream, you aren't causing burnout for their staff. Next slide, please. So when we talk about individual giving and diversifying your funding streams, we're thinking through individual donors and both your major donors. And some ways that you can do this include developing a monthly giving program. So that could be like developing a program where your donors have the option to select they want to give to this program every month to support their work. It could even be easier for your organization by, if you think about your your donate page. Do you actually have a button on your donate page that says, I want to give a reoccurring gift to the organization that is automatically taken out of their account once a month? So that is a very low lift option that you can add to your donate page for you to get monthly gifts from your organization. Another option, depending on your organization, could be identifying, cultivating, and soliciting high net worth individuals. So some platforms that I have used before to find high net worth individuals, and depending on your organization, high net worth could mean something different to you. So if we're thinking about major donors, which I also want to point out, the definition of major donors can mean something different to an organization. So for one organization, a major donor can be someone who gives over $10,000 every year to their organization, where to another nonprofit, someone who gives over $1,000 or maybe even $500 can be a major donor for them. So the major donor, major gift definition really depends on your organization. And in this example, same with high net worth individuals. It's possible that you want individuals who can give over $5,000 to your organization, whereas again, some want those individuals who can give $1 million to your organization. But that's part of the research and talking through with your team how you want to approach diversifying your revenue streams if you want to go the high net worth individual route. And later on in the presentation, we'll go through, again, some different platforms and avenues that I have used to find high net worth individuals. You can also promote bequests and endowment gifts on your website. You can encourage planned giving in wills and estate planning. You can promote the option to accept gifts of stock from donors to your organization. And you can also offer donor-only benefits such as newsletters and exclusive events. So I recently came across a nonprofit website, and they have the donor page, but then they also have a link to another page that outlines almost exactly the different ways that you can donate to their organization, which talks about bequests and endowment gifts, the wills and estate planning, and accepting gifts of stock. And it goes on to explain what each of those mean and how the donor can move forward. So sometimes the donors just don't know what ways that they can give outside of going to your page and clicking the donate button. So it's important to educate your individual donors. If you are trying to diversify how your donors are giving to you, educate them on the ways that they can give to you. Also, you can include here workplace giving and matching gifts. It can also fall under the corporate giving, but in this case, for individual giving with workplace giving, I have worked with some individuals where they nominate our nonprofit to their corporation and to their corporation, and the gift is given to our organization for the individual donor, and then matching gifts. So, reminding your donors that there are some corporations that provide matching gifts to organizations. So reminding them of that, and that's an easy way to increase, let's say, your $500 donation to $1,000 donation by just reminding your donors to ask their employers about matching gifts. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you are diversifying your funding streams to include grants or maybe expand the type of grants that you are applying for, what that could include is, let's say you are currently only applying for government grants. And so you might want to expand to include foundation and corporate grants, or you might want to expand the types of grants you are applying for. So maybe, and I know as a fundraiser, sometimes it's harder to find those general operating support grants than it can be to find the program support grants. So maybe if you have spent a lot of time looking for general operating support grants, maybe use some of your effort to find program support grants that can help you implement your programs throughout the year as you continue to look for general operating support grants. Again, if you're mostly focused on government, you can make the transition to foundation or corporate. Or if it could be opposite, if you're already focused on foundation and corporate grants, there could be some government grants that your organization might be eligible for. I will say government grants require in my experience, require a lot more time and effort in developing the proposals as well as management. So you'll want to keep that in mind, and that also goes into ensuring your organization has the capacity to diversify your funding streams, and not every stream will work for your organization. If you are going to diversify your funding streams into grants, I recommend hiring a dedicated grant writer if you have the capacity to do so, or offer training for your current staff. So if you do not have the capacity to hire a full-time grant writer, make sure those who are on your team receive the proper training by attending a grant training course, going to different sessions. Maybe I know like Foundation Center, they offer sessions all the time, making sure you have the money available to train your staff so that they can develop grants for the organization. You also want to make sure your organization is grant ready. And we'll talk about grant readiness later in the presentation, but sometimes organizations, start right away and they believe they are ready to apply for grants. And sometimes, you can get the startup grant, but sometimes in my experience, foundations want to see 3 to 5 years of experience of you operating your organization. They want to make sure there are other like individuals or other foundations who are currently supporting your work. They also want to make sure you have like 3 to 5 years of metrics to show we have seen an increase in our work over these last 3 to 5 years, and here's how your grant can support our work. So we'll talk more about grant readiness in the organizational readiness section of the presentation. Next slide, please. Another way you can diversify your funding streams is through corporate giving and sponsorships. So when we talk about corporate giving and sponsorships, sometimes people think about the larger corporations, but I always encourage organizations to think about the local companies you interact with on a daily basis. So think about your local banks, think about your local retailers, your grocery stores. Sometimes they have additional dollars that they have set aside to support community initiatives, and your organization could potentially fall within one of those initiatives. I know for Walmart, if you go to their website, you can enter their local store number and you can apply for a grant directly through that store. As part of applying to that grant, I also recommend like going to that store and getting to know like the store manager, store director to help increase your chances of potentially getting a grant from that local store. I also, since these organizations are local, I recommend like going into the bank and maybe talking to the bank manager to see what types of community giving, community grant making they might make. Also, when you think about corporations, if you're thinking about like the national banks or internet systems or cable systems, if you go to their corporate websites, they may direct you to a regional manager who manages their corporate giving for whatever region you are in. So that's also something to consider. And then, of course, you can always apply for funding from the national arm of the organization. Also, something to consider is that when it comes to corporate, a lot of corporations, of course, have their corporate social responsibility arm, but then some corporations also have a corporate foundation arm. So you want to, check to see if the corporation has a corporate social responsibility arm, and then if they have a foundation arm. Sometimes the priorities align, sometimes they vary a little bit, but that's just another avenue for you to consider when it comes to corporate giving and sponsorships. You can also pursue cause-related marketing campaign partnerships with corporations. I used to work for a food-focused organization, and we would partner with grocery stores to get donations from their employees or from customers within their grocery store. And then you can apply for corporate grants. So again, just going back to the point about corporate social responsibility and foundations, seeing which which arm might have grants available. Sometimes when it comes to corporations, if they don't have a corporate social responsibility arm, they might have their marketing and communications arm that might have a budget to give out community dollars. So also consider that as an option for corporate giving. Then lastly, again, applying for company employee giving campaigns and/or invite employees to volunteer. When you invite employees to volunteer, one, you are expanding your network of potential donors to your organization. You're increasing engagement with that corporation, which then could potentially lead to donations to your organization. And then again, applying for company employee giving campaigns. If you have a donor who currently gives to your organization, make sure your donors know to recommend your organization for employee giving campaigns. You never know how many nonprofits a donor is giving to, so you want to make sure you're staying at the top of their mind and reminding them here are ways that they can give to your organization. Next slide, please. All right, so another way that you can diversify your funding streams is through events. So you might think of galas, auctions, walkathons, online fundraising events, again, bake sales. All of these really depend on the size of your organization. When it comes to galas and other in-person events, one thing I want to point out is to make sure that you are receiving a return on your investment into the event. You want to make back the money and donations that you have spent on the event. So if you're consistently ending up in the red when you should be ending up in the black for the event, I would assess whether or not this is the right fundraising stream for you. However, galas can be a great revenue generation stream for your organization. And then we have auctions. So usually can be found at galas or other funding events. I will say from my experience working with sports teams, we always received requests from local nonprofits for items for auctions, and that was part of my role of sending items for auctions. So make sure you are reaching out again to the local companies in your community to ask them for donations for your local auctions. And then again, we talked about walkathons, and then with online fundraising events, going back to crowdfunding, online fundraising, making sure things are mobile friendly. And you can also create different types of competitions for online fundraising events, so making sure it's fun for the donors when they are giving to your organization is important. Next slide, please. And speaking of online fundraising and crowdfunding events, some ways that you can diversify your fundraising streams here include optimizing your website to receive online donations and also looking into donor platforms. So when we're thinking about online, again, it's huge to make sure your website is mobile friendly. It can be challenging for a potential donor if they're trying to give to your organization and it's very clunky. So make sure someone can easily access your website. You want to make sure your donate button is front and center on your website. I shouldn't have to look for it because donations are important to your organization. I also recommend, I believe there is an article that you can find if you just do a Google search that explains the science behind different colors of donate buttons and different fonts and things like that might be able to help your organization when it comes to online fundraising, optimizing your website to receive online donations. And I also recommend looking into donor platforms so that these will help you with reporting and developing your giving page and things like that so that it's a very easy lift for you. Another way you could diversify is by developing a crowdfunding campaign. So, depending on the size of your organization, you could potentially benefit from using platforms like GoFundMe, a Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and CrowdRise. And I'm sure there are plenty others there. And then also using social media to amplify your campaigns, share stories, and influence over donors. So if you have a social media page that is sitting dormant, I highly recommend that you are posting your stories and other campaigns on your social media, because you never know who might be following you and who might be your next donor, your next major donor, or your next grant. I remember a conversation with the program officer, and she was saying that she always looks at the social media pages of the organizations that she's meeting with and her current grantees, because there are some times where she doesn't receive an update, but she can stay updated with what the organization is doing because of their social media. So make sure you're updating your social media. Also, again, earlier I mentioned that platforms like Facebook, Instagram allow you to run online fundraising campaigns for certain organizations. And so again, when it comes to notifying your donors of how they can give to you, it could be, on your page that outlines ways to give. You can say, highlight our organization for your birthday on Facebook, on Instagram. They can create a badge that goes on their page, and individuals can donate there. You can also create a foundation page on Facebook, and then you never know who's looking at your page, who might be inspired by your mission and decide to give to your organization. So definitely use social media to your advantage, again, to share your stories and to potentially influence new donors. Next slide, please. And then we'll talk about partnerships. So in this sense, we're talking about partnering with another nonprofit to accomplish a goal. And by partnering with that other nonprofit, you're able to leverage each other's strengths and resources and possibly access new funding, because each of you brings something different that the funder or that the donor is looking for. And so through your partnerships, it helps you access new funding sources, increase your visibility, and the ability to share your best practices. And again, here I have the importance of utilizing social media to cross-promote to audiences. So by partnering with another nonprofit and they're promoting it on social media, your organization is now exposed to their followers, and then their organization is now exposed to your followers. And again, that can lead to more donations for your organization. And then, you never know what foundation might be looking, what corporation might be looking, things like that. So I recommend leveraging your partnerships and what your partners might bring to the table, so that there's possibility to lead a joint partnership in pursuing funding opportunities. Next slide, please. And then lastly, when it comes to diversifying your funding streams, is board member engagement. So this is huge to me. I always say, if the board does not give to the organization, how can you expect someone else to give to your organization? So it's very important that your board members are engaged in giving to your organization, whether that is a set amount of money that they are required to give to your organization, or if you have a give-get policy for your board members, in some way, shape, or form, they should be giving to your organization. Also, I have noticed recently in more grant applications, funders are asking the question, what is the percentage of board members giving to your organization? And you always want to answer that as 100%, because again, if less than 100% is giving to your organization, how can you expect an organization like a foundation, or sometimes a donor may even ask, how can you expect them to give if your board members don't give? So again, I highly recommend board member engagement. And by doing this, you can leverage their professional network to identify new funding. Your board members may be connected to your next donor or your next foundation or corporation that can give to your organization. So one way I recommend is possibly sitting down with your board members one-on-one to do a relationship mapping session and really thinking through individuals they might be connected to, corporations they might be connected to. You can utilize the resource. We talk about social media. You can utilize LinkedIn to see who they might be connected to, because a lot of times we accept people, or you're not staying up to date on where your former colleague now works, and it's possible they may work at a foundation and could, your board member could make that warm introduction to the foundation for you. You can also use your board members to engage in relationships with current donors. So when you're stewarding donors, and let's say you call your donors twice a year to thank them for their donations, include your board members in that process. It's not often that donors are getting a call from the nonprofits that they donate to, but then to have your board member on the call thanking the donor, I think that is something that will help set your nonprofit apart when it comes to donors and the types of organizations they give to and how many organizations they give to. And that's an opportunity to also hear, that's also an opportunity for the board member to hear directly from the donor why they are giving to the organization. And then lastly, your board members can serve as a thought partner in diversifying funding streams and potential donors. So again, just thinking about utilizing their network and engaging in relationship building. As you're thinking about funding streams, use them as a thought partner. Use them as a thought partner. I know there are some boards that have fundraising committees or development committees. Meet with them to get their insight on what it means for your organization to diversify its funding streams, and then also bring in your fundraising staff. So that way the board members can hear directly from those who are doing the work every day, which is unusual that they hear from those who do the work every day. And then the board members are bringing their perspective from sitting on the board and hearing from the CEO. And so you all can come together and think through what diversifying funding streams means for your organization. And as part of board member engagement, I know sometimes it can be difficult to have the members have the conversations with board members about how they want to help support fundraising for your organization. So for today's session, I have provided you all with a handout that could potentially help with that conversation. So we want to make sure that board member engagement is fulfilling both for your organization and for the board members. And so within that handout, you can ask them different ways you can ask them how they would like to be engaged with fundraising and the best ways that utilize their skills. So not everyone is confident to make an ask of an individual donor or a foundation. However, a board member could be a connector. So they can make the warm introductions for you. Someone can be responsible for helping your team research funding opportunities. Now, I don't mean going to Foundation Directory online, but what I mean by that is, helping to stay on top of news stories that may come across their desk from foundations or high net worth individuals that they can share with your fundraising team. But again, I think it's very important for your board members to be engaged in your fundraising efforts and also giving to your organization, because if your board members don't give, how can you expect anyone else to give to your organization? Next slide. All right, so when it comes to diversifying your funding streams, it's important to not just assess your current fundraising and determine what streams will work for you. It's important to also understand the challenges that your organization might face. So some of those challenges are limited resources, limited expertise, and understanding that every approach may not work for your organization. So when it comes to money and staff capacity, so money could mean, if you want to start hosting events, does your organization have the money to host the event? And will you receive, again, the return on your investment of putting that money into the event? Or it could be if we purchase a fundraising platform or a fundraising tool, do we have the money to purchase that? When it comes to staff capacity, again, you want to make sure your staff is not burnt out already before you add new funding streams. And then if you add new funding streams, you want to make sure they aren't burnt out, and you want to make sure that they have the tools that they need in order to effectively implement the funding stream. So you may need to pay for training, you may need to pay for development tools, but make sure that is a priority, not just we need to get this money in the door. Make sure your staff is supported during this process. And again, also make sure you're talking across the organization about how implementing these funding streams can potentially impact other areas of the organization. And again, every approach may not work for your organization. So just because it was shared here doesn't mean that there aren't more approaches, but two, that every approach will work for your organization. So that is important to know, and you should always be assessing your new funding streams throughout the year. So don't wait until December to decide whether something did or did not work. Continue to assess throughout the year so that when it gets to December, you have a full, you have 12 months of how this actually worked over the 12 months versus you trying to remember in December what may or may not have worked in May. Next slide, please. All right, so again, we talked about diversifying your funding streams, but then what do you do with those funding streams? It is important that you develop a fundraising strategy. So we have a poll here that I would like you all to take. So does your organization currently have a fully developed fundraising strategy? Okay. It looks like the majority said no, so great. This next section is for you. Some say not sure and some say yes, so great. So for those of you that say yes, there should be some nuggets in here that you should be able to take away. For those of you who say no, we'll talk through like how to develop the funding strategy and then also inserting your newly developed funding streams into the strategies. That's great. Next slide, please. So again, I want to make sure we're all starting from the same place and understand what a fundraising strategy is, so you have an understanding as we talk through the different pieces of it. So a fundraising strategy is a plan to help your organization think strategically about how to achieve its fundraising goals. It describes fundraising in the past, present, and future. The fundraising strategy is key to successful fundraising because it's a clear plan for how you are going to achieve your fundraising goals for the next year. And some organizations develop their funding strategy for the next 2-3 years. And then it's SMART. So it's strategic. It is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Next slide, please. So before you start your fundraising strategy planning, there are a few things that you will need to pull together for your organization. So the first thing you'll need to do is you'll need to know your fundraising goal and then your fundraising budget for the year. So the goal is how much money you'll need to raise. Your budget for the year is, how much money you have to apply towards the strategies to raise your fundraising goal for the year. And we'll go through each of these in the upcoming slides. You'll want to prepare a spreadsheet comparing fundraising over the last 2 to 3 years. You'll want to develop a SWOT analysis that outlines your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for your organization when it comes to fundraising. You'll list out your current and prospective donors and funders, and you'll list proposed engagement activities for each of your funding areas. Next slide, please. So when it comes to developing your fundraising goal, the individuals who are typically involved in this conversation include the development director, the chief development officer, the chief financial officer, and the CEO executive director. There could be other individuals who are involved in this process. These are the ones who are typically included. What you'll need to know when it comes to developing your fundraising goal, you'll need to know the organizational budget for the year. You'll need to know how much funding is needed for general operating support, how much is needed to operate programs, and how fundraising fits into funding general operations and how fundraising fits into funding programs. You'll want to know any special initiatives that need to be funded that you need to account for within the strategy. So for example, if I use the example of the building campaign that I used earlier, the building campaign could be in addition to the fundraising that your organization already has to lead throughout the year. So you want to make sure you are planning for that campaign or any other campaign in your fundraising strategy so you can plan when you want to reach out to funders, when you need to submit grants, things like that. And then it's also important to know how the goal was developed and any metrics and data that was used. So as a fundraiser, I have run into challenges where, I might be given a goal and I'm trying to figure out where that goal has come from, how it was developed. And sometimes there's an answer and sometimes there's not an answer. And so you don't want your fundraising team to be surprised by the goal or feel uncomfortable with the goal or just think this is too much. I don't know how we're going to hit this goal. So it's important, I think, to share with your team how the goal was developed so that they can feel better about the goal, and the strategy that will be developed for the year. I will say I am a bit more conservative when it comes to developing a fundraising goal and budget. So my increases aren't that high, whereas some increases, for some organizations can be very aggressive. So if you raise 500,000, let's shoot for 2 million. And I would probably shoot for 750,000. So I sit more on the conservative side when it comes to fundraising goals. But again, that's why it's important to have your team know how the goal was developed and what you are, and the metrics and data that were used. Next slide, please. So when you're setting up your spreadsheet, and if you have a fundraising platform, this could also be, you can also input this information in there and run a report, but not everyone has a platform. But I believe most people have access to like Google Sheets or, Excel. So this can be an easier way to do this. So what I usually do is I create a spreadsheet with several tabs on it. So the first tab is my tab that covers all of our funding streams for the organization. And then each tab after that covers each individual funding stream. So there will be an individual donor tab, board giving tab, events, private foundations, government, and other grants. But on this first tab, this is where I cover my 2 to 3 years of previous fiscal year funding. So as you see here, I have a column for, here's our goal for 2021, here are the actuals. Here's the goal for 2022, here are the actuals. And by looking at this number, this will help me get a sense of where I can map my fundraising out for 2023 and 2024. So I think that those columns are important to have. Also, other columns that I include are the percentage difference from year 1 goal to year 1-2 goal, so I can get a better sense of how much our fundraising is increasing or decreasing year after year. So that can, again, that can help as you develop your funding goal. I also think it's important to keep track of the number of people asked and the number of donors. So, in this slide here, there were 216 people asked, and the number of donors was 50. So that was like a 23%, if this percentage is correct, effectiveness of the request. But that gives you an idea of just the number of people you're reaching out to. So if your team, you don't want your team to feel bad if the donations may not be coming in, because you're tracking the number of people who have been asked to make donations, and how people respond is on them, but you want to make sure that you're tracking the number of individuals who have been asked through your individual donor requests or board giving events, etc. So those numbers are important to track, and again, the effectiveness of your request. Next slide, please. So then you want to develop your SWOT analysis. And so this is, again, thinking about what worked and what didn't work. Say the SWOT analysis, you can do the last 2 to 3 years. You can also do the last year, depending on your organization and its fundraising. But again, you want to outline your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So these are just some examples that might impact fundraising for your organization. I highly recommend that when you are developing your SWOT analysis to include everyone on your fundraising team, because the person who manages your database and the person who's developing grants might have a different opinion about the SWAT compared to the director of the department or even the CEO. So I highly recommend bringing in your entire team to work through this as make it a team effort. So some examples of strengths could be relationship building, board fundraising, and your staff expertise. Weaknesses could be staff capacity. Maybe they were overwhelmed with work, internal systems. Maybe you were down a person, or, maybe you got a huge grant and you were behind on reporting requirements for the year. And it could also be technology. Like maybe your organization has outgrown operating within Excel or Google Sheets, and you know that you need to purchase platform to manage all of your donations. Opportunities could be social media, fundraising, board network, and virtual events. And some threats could be the remote environment. People are getting used to being remote, so maybe they're not attending events as often. There could be some funding cuts. So, if you're maybe down a team member, or it could be a funding cut to foundation, or an individual donor may have lost their job. That could be a threat to your organization hitting your fundraising goals, and just an inability to pivot. So your organization may have a challenge in pivoting when things aren't going the best. So those are some examples of threats to an organization. Next slide, please. All right, so after you have assessed your last 2 to 3 years of fundraising, you have your fundraising goal, you have you've completed your SWOT analysis, you have made it a team effort. So what's next? So on the next few tabs, you will work through your prospective donors, your funding prospects, your government grants, all of your funding streams, etc. So in this presentation, we'll talk through just individual donors and funder prospects. But again, you want to make sure you're planning strategies for current grant funders to get renewal funding. You want to assess your prospects in the pipeline, and then you want to make sure you are filling in those funding gaps. And that is where your new funding streams that we talked about in diversifying the funding stream section can fit in here to help fill some of the gaps. And also you want to conduct prospect research to make sure that those funding streams work for your organization, work for the strategy that you have in place, and again, that you have the capacity to do it. So next slide, please. So, and I apologize, this is a little small. So when it comes to individual donors, I mentioned earlier that you can separate your donors into prospects, new donors, current donors. Now, the reason you do this is the communications that you send your prospects will be different from the communications you send your new donors, and different from the communications you send your current donors, as well as like major donors, and how many other segments you have for your donors at your organization. But this is what a donor tab could look like. And then you want to list out the strategy. So for your prospects, it could be you want to convert X number of prospective donors into becoming new donors within your organization. And so the action that we will take is we will send out X number of appeal letters to prospective donors, and we will approach X number of people, and then this is what we are anticipating. So it could be for your organization that you anticipate most of your prospects will give $25 to your organization. And then if average donation is $25, you can multiply that by the estimated number of individuals you think might give to your organization, and that will help you determine your estimated income. Another thing you want to make sure you outline is the estimated cost. So again, going back to the fundraising budget, you want to make sure you know what the costs are for the efforts you are putting into this work. So if your organization is sending email campaign letters, you may need to include costs to hire a marketing firm if you don't already have a marketing team in-house. If you are mailing letters, you may have to pay for the cost of a mail house to manage sending out all of the letters. So those are costs that you want to make sure are included in your fundraising budget, so that you can carry out these efforts in the strategy and action section in order to hit your fundraising goal. And you also want to make sure you keep track of the timing when you are going to reach out to prospects. So, you know, depending on your organization, when you reach out to the prospects, it could be, you know, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, whereas you reach out to new donors once a month or every other month. So I would recommend sitting down and figuring out the best time for you to reach out to your prospects, reach out to your new donors, your current donors. If you have any major donors, the best time to do that. And also sitting down and outlining the different strategies for each, as well as the number of people, the anticipated effectiveness of the request, and any estimated costs that may come from the efforts. Next slide, please. And then when we get into funder prospects, so on the grants tab of the fundraising strategy, you will list out all of your funders who you currently have grants with, right? And any of them that might end within your fundraising strategy window. So for example, if I have funders and our project ends in 2024, I want to make sure they're included in my fiscal year 23 strategy, so that when it gets closer to 2024, I can start building out a plan for how I want to approach those funders for renewal dollars. In addition to that, I also make sure that I build in funder prospects to make sure I am closing any gaps in case any of my funders decide not to renew with my organization. And that could be for a number of reasons. So it could be maybe you received multi-year funding for the last 3 years, and after 3 years, the organization says we don't give we will not give your organization any more grant funding. And so you're gonna have to make up for that loss in funding. It could be, you know, maybe something happened within the organization, within the foundation. So they're going to have to decrease their funds. They could be going through a strategic planning process, and so funding is on hold. So you always want to make sure you have funder prospects, even if what I just explained is not happening to your current funders. You still want to make sure you have funder prospects. So you don't want to rely on one stream of income. You don't want to just rely on those 10 funders to come in the door every year. You always want to be adding funder prospects to your list. And so this is just an example of what adding funder prospects could look like when you add it to your fundraising strategy. So you know, your foundation name, the priority area in this sense is referring to whether it's general operating support or program support. If you apply for grants, you know, priority area generally means like the issue areas the foundation is focusing on. And then their average giving. So if I need to fill a $100,000 gap, I now have a list of funders who could potentially help me fill that gap with $120,000, and I would be over my funding goal. Then I list out the application due date and then any strategy for outreach. So similar to the individual donor slide where we listed out a strategy and activity, I want to make sure I have a strategy for my funder prospects. Now, when it comes to foundations, not every foundation will be interested in having a meeting with you. So it's important to review their website in detail to understand the best approach for that foundation. So for some, it could be to send a letter of inquiry. The second funder, you know, they allow you to request meetings before submitting. So, you know, you can request a funder meeting. Maybe for the third foundation, you have done relationship mapping with your board member and you found out that they have a connection to this foundation. Ask your board member to make a warm ask. So when you add funder prospects, also outline what your strategy is going to be to reach out to them so that they don't just sit in your fundraising strategy with no actions. Also, one thing I did not mention was the importance of outlining which individual on the team is responsible for each part of the work. Now, it's easier if you have separate individuals to work on grants and someone else to work on donors. Those two, you know, it's easy to know who's responsible for what. But if your team is, you know, if you have a mix of everyone working on different projects across individual donors and grants, you definitely want to make sure you list out who is responsible for what part of the work, and also include your board members in there. If there's any board member outreach, make sure you're including what board member is responsible for helping you with this work. Next slide, please. So after we have set up all of our tabs, we know we know where we stand with current fundraising, we know what our goal is. So we're ready to start implementing the fundraising strategy. It is important that you measure the success of the work. So you want to make sure, again, that you are tracking the percentage of total revenue coming from each funding source. You're tracking the ROI for each funding activity. You're tracking the number of donors compared to outreach. You're analyzing your data to what worked and what did not work, and you're adjusting your efforts as needed. So again, that's why it's important to measure where you are throughout the year instead of in December, because it's hard in December at the end of the year to think back to what you've done over the last 11 months and then make a determination on what worked and what didn't work. Whereas maybe after every campaign or after every grant ends, or after you submit every grant, you're meeting with your team to say, okay, what worked, what didn't work in this process? How can we adjust for the next campaign, the next grant application? And that will make I think that will make the process easier for everyone. Next slide, please. And then also something that you can develop to support your fundraising strategy is a case for support. So this is a 3 to 10 page document that outlines, it's a resource for developing proposals and donor documents. It includes your history, mission, fundraising goals, impact, program description, sustainability plans, all of the things that funders would ask about your organization or individual donors. You also want to, the case for support should answer, how does this organization help people? Who do we help? What vital services do we offer? What is our organization's track record? What are our plans for the future? How do we use our money? And why do we deserve support? So again, your case for support should answer all of these questions. Now, depending on the age of your organization and the materials that you already have developed, you may or may not need to develop a case for support. However, if this is your first time developing a strategy and you are moving into let's say grants, I highly recommend developing a case for support. You can also use this for your individual donors, especially as a tool to track your stories that you might want to share with donors throughout the year, and stories that you can include in your donor letters as you're mailing out your appeals during the year. Next slide, please. Something else you'll also want to develop is a communications plan. So as we were going through the tab on individual donors, we outlined actions and strategies. And so it can be helpful to develop a communications plan, a communications calendar for how, for when your organization will reach out to those donors. So hopefully in the individual donor tab, you have listed your timing for when you're going to communicate with them, so it will be easy to plug in. If you didn't, what you can do is this. You, of course, want to segment your target audience. So, for example, major donors, grassroots donors, prospective donors, things like that. Then you want to determine how many appeals and or campaigns you want to run during the year and how often to communicate with your audience. So if you've outlined that in your fundraising strategy, that's great. It would just be a plug and play here. If not, you want to make sure you really think through how many times you want to communicate with each segment of donors. Then you want to list out your proposed launch dates and communication methods for each. So you want to know what your target, and you also want to know what your target goal is for each campaign. So when it comes to the target goal for each campaign, you want to make sure it rolls up into your overall fundraising goal. So it's these actions are helping you hit that fundraising goal. And then when you're listing out the proposed launch dates, you want to make sure that there's enough time to where donors aren't feeling as if you're communicating with them every single day, but you know, like there's a good window in between how often you're communicating with them. Then you want to add the campaign and outreach to a calendar. You'll begin by developing the timeline for each campaign and outreach by the launch date. So once you place it on the calendar, for example, if I am sending a grant appeal, or if I'm sending a donor appeal December 1st, I put it on the calendar for December, and that's the date that I want to send the email. So maybe at the end of September or October, because this, depending on your organization, developing the appeals can take a while, especially if you have different levels of approval that they need to go through. You want to backwards map from that date everything that you need to do. So on December 1st, you can send that appeal. And on November 30th, it's just going through, you're uploading everything to the system so it can go out. And then you want to develop your materials and track your metrics, again, throughout the year, including your response rate, number of donations, new donors to current donors, etc. And so next slide, please. On this slide, this is just an example of a communications calendar. It's really simple, and it's something your whole team can access. So I've listed out the months here, the type of the email letter content. So for example, in August, it's a back to school email, sending it August 16th. It's an advocacy letter to talk about the importance of the work and the details. It's summer's over, and whatever other details you want to include in your campaign letter. If you don't have something for that month, mark it as TBD and make sure you're going back to add what you will send out that month. But letters can, the different types of letters can be advocacy, cultivation, stewardship, etc. You again want to make sure you're outlining what it's going to be. And if it's an email campaign, it could be a series of a number of emails for a week. So if you're sending different community stories, for example, like what I have here in October, maybe there's a week for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, you're going to send 3 different emails. They're going to highlight 3 different stories about individuals you serve. And then those are the emails that you are sending for the month of October. How you set up your calendar depends on the organization. The number of communications depends on your organization. You just want to make sure that you map it out for your team so everyone knows. Everyone knows on your team when you're communicating, but it's also helpful to share with your marketing and communications team so that you aren't sending too many emails to too many individuals across your organization on any one day. Also, what I include in the communications calendar are deadline dates for any grants, just so, again, everyone is aware of what's happening within our fundraising team at one time, and the external documents that are leaving our team for funding. Next slide, please. All right, so we talked about the fundraising strategy and different strategies that you want to include when you're developing different funding streams you want to include in your fundraising strategy. One strategy that I definitely want to plug is Giving Tuesday. So if your organization has not considered participating in Giving Tuesday, it's this year, November 28th, 2023. I highly recommend that you do it. Giving Tuesday was created in 2012 to serve as a day of doing good. And so if you visit their website, they provide toolkits, individual donor letters, social media templates that you can use to make sure that the process is easy for you to participate in Giving Tuesday. So I definitely want to plug that to you all so that you can participate in that. And we actually have 2 poll questions related to Giving Tuesday. And the first is, does your organization plan to run a Giving Tuesday campaign this year? Okay, it's great to see 44% are saying yes, 36% not sure, and 20% no. So for those of you who are not sure and the answer is no, I highly recommend, again, going to Giving Tuesday. Going to Giving Tuesday's website, they make it very easy for you to run a social media campaign to get donors to your organization. And I mean, in my experience, I think people are fully aware of Giving Tuesday, so they know it's that day after, that Tuesday after Thanksgiving, where it's the day to give. So if you're not already considering it, I highly recommend that you do. And then we have another poll related to Giving Tuesday, which is, will this be your organization's first Giving Tuesday campaign? Okay, great. It's good to see that this will be most of your first time running the Giving Tuesday campaign. So that's exciting to see, and I wish you all much success with running your campaign. Looks like 40% say no, so you are you are very familiar with how Giving Tuesday goes, and then 16% says not sure. So again, just wanted to plug that as a way to potentially get new donors into your organization. All right, so let's talk about the cycle of philanthropy, and it's also known as the fundraising cycle, and it's how you're building relationships with your individual donors and your foundations to lead to getting money in the door for your organization. Next slide, please. So the cycle of philanthropy can be defined in five different areas. So it starts with identification, then which is prospect research to identify prospective donors and funders. Then we move into the qualification stage, and that is when you determine alignment between your organization and the donor and funder. Then you move into cultivation, where we talk about building relationships and engaging the prospective donor and funder. And then solicitation, when everyone wants to know, making the ask. And then, once that money is awarded, either from a donor or funder, stewardship, and then setting yourself up for renewal. So next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk through identification and qualification. So again, identification is when you conduct prospect research to identify prospective donors and funders and determine alignment. And qualification is the determining alignment piece, and making sure that that organization and your organization, there is strong alignment between both. I highly recommend, when you are identifying and qualifying your prospects, to develop meeting briefs and prospect profiles that outline specific details both about organizations and individuals. And so when you are qualifying, some things that you want to look for, again, organizational alignment, their previous giving history. So have they given to organizations that are similar to yours? Preferred methods of contact, any relationship mapping. So if there are any connections to the leadership of your organization or any of your board members, I recommend reading the bios of program officers. And then if there are any and then look at their current grantees, again, to see if there are any similarities. So some tools that I use to research donors and foundations include Donor Search and Wealth Engine. Wealth Engine is more for the high net worth individuals. Donor Search, I believe they include all types of donors, and you can, all types of donors. Both of those are paid platforms. You can do a Google search if you're looking for philanthropists in your region. You can set a Google alert for the latest philanthropy news, and if there's any donations given, things like that are big news stories, you can get those Google alerts to your work email. And then when it comes to researching grants, grants.gov for government grants, Foundation Directory Online is my personal favorite for researching foundations. I also utilize Instrumental as well as GrantStation to find grant opportunities. But again, when you're identifying and qualifying the organization, you want to make sure that there is strong alignment between the work that the funder is supporting and that the individual is interested in and your organization. So what that could look like is you're finding a donor who has an interest in education, but is digging deeper to, maybe Google searching their name to see what types of organizations they are giving to, or using their, inputting their name into donor search and seeing what types of organizations they're giving to. And then that can tell you, okay, I know they're interested in education, but based on their giving, they're more interested in K through 12 than college access, or they might be interested in pre-K. So those are ways you want to dig deeper and identify and qualify the interest area of the organizations. Also, with current grantees and looking at foundation lists, they could be very broad in, for example, their definition of education again, right? But then as you're looking at their current grantees, you'll see their definition of you'll see by their giving, education means to them, they're mostly given to universities, colleges and universities. So that's why it's important, again, to dig deeper to really understand where these organizations and individuals are giving their money. Next slide, please. All right, so the cultivation stage, this is when you start building the relationship, engaging the funder, engaging the donor, and preparing to make the ask. So in the cultivation stage, it is important to note that the length of the cultivation stage can depend on the donor, can depend on the funder. I have been in conversations where it has taken over a year to cultivate a donor, and I have been in conversations with a foundation that has only taken 3 months. So it really depends on the donor and the funder. So some ways that you can cultivate both the donor and funder, you can email the funder to ask for an introduction meeting. So earlier I mentioned that some foundations are open to meetings. For those that are, definitely send them an email and ask for an introduction meeting. In that introduction email, I always, of course, include what organization I'm representing, and I also tell them how our organization aligns with the work that they're currently funding. This shouldn't be too challenging for you because in the identification and qualification stage, you have already determined what the alignment is between your organization and between their organization. And so that is what you want to include in the email. Also, if there are any links to your work that you can insert into the email so they can just click and open it and see, oh, wow, they really do align with our organization, that's even better. I tend to not send like PowerPoint and too many documents. One, because a lot of us are on our phones and you don't have the time to really open so many documents, and PowerPoint might look different on one phone compared to on the laptop. But also I try to just put like the high level information in the body of the email. And then also what I do is I suggest a specific date for us to meet. So I don't really leave it, I give them a week. So I'll say, are you available to meet the week of October 9th, for example? I try not to leave it open-ended to say, please let me know when you're available. I try to be very specific about when I would like to meet so that they are looking at their calendar for that particular week. And then of course you want to, if you send an email, you don't hear from them, always send a follow-up email. Individuals are busy, and so maybe they read your email on the go, couldn't get to it, and sometimes that follow-up can help. You can also send event invitations. For individual donors, in my experience, they might be more likely to attend than sometimes program officers, but you can definitely send event invitations. You can schedule site visits. You can engage in peer-to-peer networking, and you can also submit letters of inquiry. So for the foundations who don't like to have meetings with nonprofits, that sometimes their first method is to submit a letter of inquiry. So, you can definitely submit that as your way of building a relationship with the funder. Again, the amount of time it takes to cultivate a funder can depend on the funder or donor can depend on the funder or donor. So if you're not gaining any traction within the first, month, don't worry. Sometimes it can actually take a while. Next slide, please. All right, so we've cultivated the donor and it's time for us to make the ask. And again, the timeline from cultivation to solicitation can vary. If I know that I have been cultivating a funder for a while and they have an upcoming deadline, I of course want to hit that upcoming deadline. So maybe that process only took a few months, or there are some funders who only open their grant period once a year. So again, it can take longer than a few months to reach out to them. And again, for the donor, it depends on how much cultivation, when you've been cultivating them, and when you think the appropriate time is to make the ask. But yeah, in the solicitation phase, this is when you are making the ask for funding. You are presenting a case for why the organization needs funding and outlining the impact the donations will have. So some of the talking points that are in your case for support, you can use in these conversations with funders and individual donors. So some ways you can make the ask is an in-person meeting, through direct mail campaigns and appeals. So thinking back to the donor calendar that we shared a few slides ago, where you map out when you want to communicate with the donors, you can map out there when the appeal is going to be a solicitation, when you are actually making the ask for money. You can also send letters of inquiry and full proposals. Also, in my experience, it's not included here, but I have been on email chains where the ask has been sent over email, or when the ask is over the phone. So it's possible that there could be other ways to make an ask to a potential funder or an individual donor. These are just some of the most common ways to do it. Next slide, please. So again, everyone always wants to know, like, when is the right time to make an ask? And that, again, it truly depends upon the relationship that you have been building with the individual donor and the relationship that you have been building with the funder when it comes to like making that in person or over email, that phone call, direct ask of the foundation of the individual donor. So when it comes to solicitation, one, you should already be fully prepared with the donor profile to help you make an informed ask of the donor. So you don't want to make sure you are asking for too little when the individual donor has the capacity to give more. But by doing your research, that will help you determine how much you can ask the donor for. So again, you want to take the time to cultivate the donor, and cultivate the funder. You want to be specific about the amount. So don't say, oh, it would be great if you could give around $20,000, because giving around $20,000 can mean we'll give you $15,000 to $18,000 when you actually need the 20. So be specific about the amount that you will ask for. Also, be prepared for a yes or a no and how you will follow that up. So once you make the ask, and plenty of articles will tell you to sit in the silence and give the donor time to respond to you. Don't continue talking. So you make the ask, you sit in the silence, and you let the donor respond to you. But you want to be prepared for a yes or a no. The yes is great. You know what you need to do internally to get moving on the donation. If the answer is no, it is important to know that no does not mean no forever. It could just mean no for right now. You don't know how many other nonprofits are currently cultivating this donor. Excuse me, you don't know what their other financial obligations are, and maybe it's just not the right time. But if you hear no, you can always ask them, are there other ways that you can donate your time or talent to the organization to make sure you're continuing to cultivate them and hopefully set yourself up for success, so the next time you ask, the answer can be yes, or they may write the check for the $20,000. And you always want to be confident. So again, going back to being specific about the amount, be confident in your ask and what you are asking of the donor and what you are asking of the funder. That is very important. And something else, I'm not sure how many of you heard, but when it comes to asking donors for money, you can always say time, talent, or treasure, right? And so how can they donate their time to the organization? How can they donate their talent? Or how can they donate their treasure? Obviously, when it comes to fundraising, the first approach is the treasure. But again, you hear a no, think of other ways that you can continue to engage this donor in the work. Don't stop cultivating them just because you hear a no. And then when it comes to foundations, let's say you receive a no on a grant application, hopefully you would have been building a relationship with the program officer over X number of months to where you could potentially call them to ask like what there was about the grant application that maybe the board decided not to approve it after so many conversations. And you still want to continue cultivating that program officer so that, when it's time to apply again, you were in a great space to do that. Next slide, please. So if you do hear a yes, the biggest things are stewardship and renewal. So you want to make sure you are thanking your donor for the gifts and maintaining and growing the relationship with the donor and the funder. And some ways you can do this are to send monthly and quarterly emails. I like to do this with foundations because sometimes they only hear from us when it's time to submit interim and final reports. So just sending monthly and quarterly emails to let them know what's happening with the work. You can also send them to donors. You can also invite donors on site visits. When it comes to foundations, again, the interim and final reporting. You can also share media hits and new reports. So if your organization, I remember there are some organizations in here that focus on policy and advocacy. So if there is a new report that has come out for your organization, send that to your program officer, send that to the individuals you've been cultivating so they are up to date on what your organization is doing and you're not waiting to tell them about everything when you're cultivating them on a call. Also share any media hits, like maybe your organization was featured in the New York Times or someone or your executive director or CEO sat on a panel, recorded a webinar or something. Make sure you're sharing those news stories with your donors and funders. Again, invite them on site visits. You can host donor-focused events. And if your organization develops an annual report, you can include a donor list in that report as another way of highlighting the donors and funders that have given to your organization. Also, if your organization has a website where you highlight your donors and funders, you can do it there as well. And then when it comes to the renewal stage, again, the timing will vary by donor and the relationship you've cultivated with them over the last few months to a year or more. So the timing will vary for renewal. However, when it comes to grants, I typically start the conversation with the funder 3 to 4 months before the end of the grant period in order to talk about what we would do with the next round of funding from the donor. And I'm not waiting until the grant has ended before asking them for more money. So that is stewardship and renewal piece, and that is the fundraising cycle. So next slide, please. And then lastly, I just want to quickly talk about some organizational readiness and fundraising tools that might be helpful to your organization as you build out your fundraising efforts. Next slide. All right, let's start with the culture of philanthropy. So a lot of times in nonprofits, staff might think fundraising lives just within the fundraising department. Yes, on a day-to-day basis it does. However, everyone in your organization can be a fundraiser for the organization. So it's important that you create a mindset of giving amongst your staff. You can provide opportunities for staff to get involved with fundraising efforts. What that can include, if you are calling donors again for thank you calls, you can include some of your staff on the call, thanking the donors for the support. If your donors are coming on site visits, you can invite one of your staff members from a different team to join the site visit so they understand how you talk to donors. You can even invite them to a meeting with the funder so that they understand how your team operates. You can also meet with each department to educate them on what the fundraising team does, and then provide the staff with talking points for external partners. So a lot of times our program teams are meeting with so many external partners, depending on the organization, sometimes more than the fundraising team. And so it is important to equip your program team with talking points that the fundraising team would use with potential donors, because you never know when your program staff might be out working and they run into a program officer, and if they have quick bullet points that they can touch on in the conversation, that can lead to a conversation for your team. So I always recommend meeting with each department, having them understand what the fundraising team does, how the other departments can support the efforts of the fundraising team, and provide them with talking points for external partners. Next slide, please. Next, we have a gift acceptance policy. So this is very important because it helps your organization maintain honesty, transparency, and integrity across all of its fundraising practices. It helps you develop policies for accepting donations that may be controversial. So let's say you're receiving a gift, or one of your longtime donors is in the news for something that your organization may not agree with, or the community may not agree with, or something like that. So by having this policy in place, it will help your organization decide when or when you won't accept donations, what you consider controversial, things like that. It also helps you set donor expectations for the organization. And then it's a plan for keeping accurate records of all donations and expenses. So here's our policy for how we will accept gifts. Here's how we will track our records. And here's how we will track our expenses, things like that. Next slide, please. And then earlier, I talked about grant readiness when it comes to diversifying funding streams and adding a grant funding stream. So it is important to determine your organization's grant readiness. And these are not all of the questions. You can easily Google like a grant readiness checklist. These are just some questions that I have seen often when applying for grants. So has the organization been in operation for 3 to 5 years? Is the organization incorporated as a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, or does the organization have a fiscal sponsor? So you want to make sure you're a nonprofit or have a fiscal sponsor. Can your organization demonstrate success? Does the organization have a financial management system in place? Has the organization met its local, state, and federal reporting requirements? And does the organization have a clear mission statement? So when it comes to the 3 to 5 years of funding, it is important to note that not just 3 to 5 years in operation, but 3 to 5 years of funding, 3 to 5 years of managing your metrics, 3 to 5 years of operating your program, as well as are there other funders and individual donors supporting your work? What I've seen is that some funders don't want to be the sole supporter of your work. So you want to show the organization you have been able to sustain yourself for 3 to 5 years before they even come in the door to fund one of your projects or fund general operating support. So again, if you want to see a full checklist, I would recommend just doing a Google search on a grant readiness checklist, and then go through all of those if grants are not a current funding stream for you all. Next slide, please. And then we have fundraising process and tools. And so when it comes to developing fundraising processes and tools, you want to develop and document your process for how donations will be managed, including the appropriate teams and timelines for stewardship. So again, there are other teams you may be involved with fundraising. So when you're developing your process, you want to sit down and think about all the teams that may touch a donation as it comes in. It could be the person at the front desk who gets the check, writes down when the check is received. It could be, here's how long it takes finance to process the donation as it comes in. So things like that. So really sit down and think through the appropriate teams and the timelines for stewardship. Then you want to develop a grants calendar so that you can manage all of your grant opportunities. If you utilize a platform, it's easy to insert the grant proposals that are due, create a report on proposals due and when proposals are submitted, so you can easily run that report. You can utilize a donor management software system to track your outreach data and progress towards your goals. You can also utilize online giving platforms, to make it easier to receive your donations. And you want to make sure you're storing all your agreements, donor letters, proposals in a central location. So it could be Dropbox, it could be Google Drive, it could be a shared drive, depending on your organization, but make sure you are storing all of your agreements. I like to store donor letters because sometimes donors reach out to say they didn't receive a letter. And it's just easier to resend that letter because I have it stored. And then, you know, all of your proposals in a central location. Next slide, please. So as we go into questions, I just want to quickly review everything that we covered in the session. So we talked about the importance of diversifying your fundraising streams for long-term planning and sustainability, developing a funding strategy to help you map out how your organization will raise money through your current funding streams, preparing a communication strategy to ensure you are communicating with your donors and funders frequently, assessing your organization's capacity to build out new funding streams and investing in training if possible, assessing your organization's grant readiness before applying for grant funding, using data to measure success toward the fundraising goal, always having an amount in mind when making the ask and being confident about that amount and doing the research to make sure the amount you're asking for falls in line with what the donor or funder tends to support, and then developing internal processes for how you will manage donations, grants, and other funding as it comes in. And so that is the end of this part of the presentation, and we will move into questions. Oh, next slide. Thank you.
I can jump in if you guys haven't already added some questions to the chat. Please do so. We're just waiting to see if any of you have questions or have anything you're curious about or wanted to elaborate on. And I think I see one question in here. Okay, so first question, if you aren't able to hire a grant writer, are there any trainings you would recommend to become a better grant writer? And are there any other alternatives?
Yes, so if you are unable to hire a grant writer, you can look at if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, you can look at the Grant Training Center. It's based in Arlington, and I believe they did have in-person before the pandemic. I'm not sure if they're still in person or if it's virtual, but they definitely have grant writing trainings that you can look into. You can also look into Foundation Center, Candid, it's their new title. They offer grant writing training courses so that you can understand the basics of grant writing and the how to develop letters of inquiry and proposals and things like that. You can look into the Chronicle of Philanthropy. They may offer some grant writing courses. I know they offer philanthropy workshops and other webinars. I'm not quite sure about philanthropy training, but you can look there. Also look into Grant Professionals Association and the Association of Fundraising Professionals. They may have trainings that are available. That are available. And then you can also hire a consultant to do a training for your staff to understand the nuances that go into grant writing. So there are a number of opportunities that you can pursue in order to understand grants without hiring a grant writer.
All right, thank you. So question number 2. For new nonprofits, are there best practices or guidance for stages of fundraising? You mentioned foundations want to generally see 3 to 5 years of impact data before they offer funds. With that in mind, for the first 3 years of an org, should they prioritize individual and startup, or are there other targeted approaches?
Yeah, so if you're in the first 3 years of your organization, I would definitely prioritize individual donors. One, because, you know, as we saw, they are the most common form of fundraising for organizations. You can also prioritize startup grants, although I'm not sure how many there are for organizations. So I would the first approach would definitely be individual donors. Depending on your organization and the type of work that you do, it could also be, again, going to your local bank, your local corporations to see what grants might be available to new organizations supporting individuals within the communities where companies work. You could also, you don't have to wait until you're 3 to 5 years in to start building relationships with program officers. So, you can have those introductory conversations so that when you get to that 3-year mark, they might be willing to give you dollars, or it's possible that they might, be so intrigued by your work that they might give you a grant 2 years in. But my first approach would be to approach individual donors. You could research some startup grants. You can also look into some general operating support grants. There are, I have seen grants where they say if your budget is less than, for example, $100,000, those are the types of grantees they are looking for. So startup, general operating support, and still work on building those relationships with organizations, because you never know where it's not a hard and fast rule for the 3 to 5 years. So you never know where you might meet that program officer who might be willing to give your organization a grant when it's 2.5 years old or something. So hopefully that answers your question.
All right, and we have a couple more. So next question is, how do you find new donors? Is LinkedIn a good strategy?
I have never used LinkedIn to find donors. The methods that I use are Donor Search and Wealth Engine, and I understand that those are paid platforms. So if you can afford to pay for them, great. If you cannot afford to pay for them, I would say the low-cost method would be Google searches. So for example, if your organization focuses on arts, and if you're looking at a local art museum, you're looking at the donors who have given to the art museum, you can look at, and they have an annual report, you can look at that list of donors and research each person in Google to get a better sense of like what they're funding. Are they a major donor in your region? And then you can, and you can get a sense of if they're major donors in your region. And depending on the individual, it could be reaching out to a company to see if they would be interested in meeting with, if the high net worth individual is interested in meeting with your nonprofit organization and learning about the work. You can also, the annual reports, looking at organizations that are similar to yours, the Google search, setting the Google alerts. If there are particular people you are trying to keep track of and they're philanthropic giving in your region, you can set a Google alert. I know it's a little weird, but you can set a Google alert to see like where their giving is going. And again, you can set a Google alert for philanthropy in your region. You could probably set it to where articles include X millions of dollars or X $100,000 or something like that. To see. So hopefully that answers your question when it comes to high net worth. But the quickest way, honestly, would be utilizing a platform. But I'm not sure if the Foundation Center is still open on K Street if you are based in DC. However, some libraries have access to Foundation Directory. So I would also see if some libraries access to Donor Search. They might, but I'm not exactly sure. I know I would access Donor Search when I would go to the Foundation Directory.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think we have 2 more questions and we'll move on. So the next question is regarding staff member engagement in the philanthropic space. So can the staff members be incentivized in some way by their supervisors?
You could potentially incentivize them. I think it depends on the culture of your organization. I would say part of it could be you can use it as a professional development opportunity within the organization. So hopefully your organization provides professional development for its staff. And then this could be an effort to where you say, you know, we are offering an opportunity for you to learn other areas of the work within our organization. And if there's someone on your team that might be interested in fundraising, you know, that's an opportunity where maybe they work with fundraising for, I don't know, an hour a week or an hour a month or something like that. That's one way you can promote staff engagement in the space. I don't know, I think, I'm not exactly sure how else you can incentivize them because it is still work. So I would say the biggest thing would probably be promoting it as a professional development opportunity in the organization, especially if it's staff that may not pursue any other professional development opportunities. So that's one way that you can do it. I don't know if you received some sort of award or something like that in the culture of your organization, but if you do, that could also be something else. But I would definitely promote it as professional development internally, that can help them. And that's something you can discuss during goal setting for the year. And if it's maybe a junior member on your staff and talking about professional development, and you can ask them if there are any other areas of the organization that they would like to learn, and finding out what their ultimate goals are and how you can best support them. So development covers so many areas of the organization that people don't necessarily think about, because like when we're developing grants, you're working with the program team to flesh out what the program is. If it's a new program, you're working with leadership, you're working with finance to understand how to develop budgets, you're managing a donor system. So we touch so many different pieces of the work that I would promote it as professional development.
Okay, very nice. And we have one last question. Are there any resources or recommendations you can share to learn more about impact investing?
Resources I can share around impact investing. Let's see. I go to the Chronicle of Philanthropy often for different resources there. They're always having a webinar. I think like maybe once a week or every 2 weeks, they're having a webinar about something. Let's see. I'm trying to think of some of the resources that I look into often. Chronicle of Philanthropy. I would say I would honestly check LinkedIn and, you know, in the search using quotations, type in impact investing and see what might pop up there. There might be a thought leader on impact investing who publishes articles and other resources for you to access regarding impact investing. I would say on the corporate side, maybe just looking at what corporations are currently funding to get a better sense of impact investing. Like, you know, for example, like, are corporations moving in a certain direction, for example, like financial education, or more so than another issue area. Other impact investing. Yeah, I would honestly, Google Alerts save so much time and effort. So I would also recommend setting a Google Alert on impact investing and see what pops up. I would let it run for like the next month or two and see what pops up around impact investing and what resources and maybe webinars might be available.
Okay, thank you for answering all the questions. And I'll come back on camera, but thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us and for providing this wonderful training. And I definitely learned a lot today. So thank you so much. So I want to close out and do a few next steps. So for those of you who are interested in joining the next session, October 11th, we'll be doing how to map out a strategic vision. So if you haven't RSVP'd for that, please do so. It'll be a great opportunity to learn about strategic planning. And in person, if any of you are in the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, please attend our racial wealth divide training. This will be an in-person opportunity to learn about the work that we've been doing over the past year and odd months around building high impact nonprofits of color focused in the DC area. So we have a profile we will reveal a lot of the research around the racial wealth divide data that happens in the area. So we'll be facilitating that locally. So please take a look at the email link. We'll email the RSVP link for that. So you'll hopefully come out to see us in person, and also please complete the survey. So we always appreciate hearing your feedback. And if you haven't already, please feel free to join one of our networks. There's always a ton of opportunities to engage. So we have a ton of networks that you can join and participate in more engaging opportunities and discussions with your peers. But thank you all so much. Take action with one of our Prosperity Now campaigns. Like I said, there's so many opportunities to come and engage and join with the work Prosperity Now does. But thank you all so much for joining today. Please enjoy the rest of your day and fill out the survey. So thank you all.